If you want to build and run the Wicked engine for yourself from source code, I will demonstrate how to run the editor for yourself. This is the directory that you download from GitHub and contains the whole repository source code. At the bottom you will find the wickedengine.sln file. If you are on Windows, this is what you will need to use. If you open it in Visual Studio, you can just simply press F5 or click this green arrow button on the top. The editor Windows project will be built and run by default. You will notice that this is a debug build and performance will be slow, which is noted on the top left corner of the application. If you want to change this and build a release mode application that has normal performance, then you will need to choose the release configuration from here. A common mistake is to try to just find the executable that Visual Studio built and try to run that standalone without Visual Studio. If you go back to the directory that you downloaded, after you build the editor, an uppercase build directory will be generated for you. And within that, you will find here the editor windows.exe, which is the executable of the editor, but it is not enough in this case for you to run the editor. Let's see what happens when you try to do it. The window starts up and closes, or some errors could be reported. To fix this, you will need to actually set the working directory for this executable, or copy it to the editor directory, which is not the build directory, editor Windows directory, but the actual editor directory. If you go back to Visual Studio, Visual Studio does set up this directory automatically if you navigate to the editor Windows project properties. You can find the required directory, the working directory within the debugging settings, and it's called the $project dir. This means that it will use that directory that the project file is inside. You can also just open the edit mode of this field and check out this directory. So, as you can see, the correct directory to run this executable from is, let's copy this executable, and in the root of the repository there is the editor directory that contains editor source code and some shaders that have been also built. And the shaders are the ones required to be found near the executable. If you copy the executable here and try to run it now, it will start up successfully. Another way is to, let's delete this and go back to the build directory. I recommend this way to specify the working directory without always copying the executable for yourself, is to create a shortcut for this. And within the shortcut properties, you can specify the startup directory here. So just copy the path of the editor directory in this text box. Press OK. Go back to the shortcut. Start it, and it will start successfully. Then, if you want, you can just create a shortcut. Just copy this shortcut to the desktop or pin it to the taskbar for you to be able to always simply just start it up without requiring Visual Studio. Now, this is okay for development, but you probably don't want to rely on this executable and working directory settings when you try to release an application built with Wicked Engine, such as the editor. If you download the editor executable from GitHub builds or releases, or the Steam version or the Microsoft Store version, you will find that it contains an executable that you can run without the shaders directory being nearby it or anything. You can just run the executable standalone. To make that possible, you will need to build the shaders into the executable. There is a simple way for you to do it. Is to run the offline shader compiler project. Set it as the startup project. Go to the properties. And within the command line arguments, you can specify what kind of shaders you want to build into the executable. For example, HLSL6, SPIRV. These make the shaders available both for DirectX 12 and Vulkan. And then shader dump. These three arguments will make all the shaders be rebuilt with DX12 and Vulkan support and embed them into a C++ header file. Press OK. By the way, you can see the help for this executable if you just run it without any command line arguments. Let's run this. Wait for it to build. The executable starts up, prints the help information, and starts printing all the shader building information. After the shaders have been built, then the shader dump will be created, since I specified the shader dump argument for this executable. In a debug build, this can take slightly longer than in a release build as well. After the shader dump has been generated, it reports that it has been written to wi_shaderdump.h, which is a C++ header file. You can close this now and navigate to the engine repository. Within that, the Wicked Engine folder, and then the wi_shaderdump file was generated here. This file is a large C++ header file. You don't need to open it. Just make sure that you rebuild the engine again with this header file being available, and that will include all your shaders into the executable, so they don't have to be opened from separate files. To make that simple, just go back to the Visual Studio, go back to the set the editor windows as startup project again, and you can choose rebuild. This will rebuild the engine and the editor. If you don't want to wait for a full rebuild, you can go to the wi_renderer.cpp. You can find that in the Wicked Engine source, engine, graphics, filter. Just save this file, or Ctrl F7 recompile this file for the changes to take effect, because this file tries to include the wi_shaderdump.header file. If it's found, if it's not found, then it will simply fall back to loading shaders from separate files. It can take a bit longer to recompile the wi_renderer.cpp, because this is a larger file than the usual files. Once it's been recompiled, you can relink and run the editor. If the shader dump has been embedded successfully to the executable, open the backlog, and you can verify in the startup text that if it prints embedded shaders found, then that means the shaders are built into the executable. Otherwise, it would report the shader file path. To verify that it is indeed a standalone executable now, let's close it, the editor, go back to where the executable was built. We don't need this shortcut any longer, so I just delete it to avoid any confusion. You will be able to simply run the editor from here because it doesn't need any other files to operate. You can also see that this executable is now pretty large, larger than before. It's about 50 megabytes now, which includes all the embedded shaders for DirectX 12 and Vulkan. You can also grab this executable and place it anywhere that you want. For example, to your desktop. And run it from there. Should be no problem at all. It will generate a config.ini for you. That's just something specific to the editor. It contains some default user settings. You also notice that in my desktop directory, I do have some other shortcuts for Wicked Engine, and that is pretty useful for me to switch between DirectX 12 and Vulkan rendering modes. Let's check out how to do that. Let's go back to the build directory again, undo the copying of the editor exe. Oops. So this is our build directory. Let's say that now I want to run this executable as a Vulkan instead of DX12. I will show you now that by default it runs with DX12 mode. And you can find that out by looking at the backlog. It gets printed that first thing it created the graphics device DX12. You can also see that if you go to the general options info display or the version display, it will display the engine version and that it is running in DX12 mode. If you want to run it in Vulkan mode, then you can specify startup arguments in the shortcut properties. So create a shortcut again. Within the shortcut, I don't need to specify the working directory anymore. This directory will be sufficient because the shaders are already embedded in this executable. The startup arguments can simply be specified in the target after the exe. So if I want Vulkan rendering device, then just write Vulkan in here. Save the shortcut, run this now. You might see that now the information display switched to Vulkan. And the backlog printout for the startup also switched to graphics device Vulkan. This way you can very easily switch between DX12 and Vulkan modes for the editor or your own application. Just create two shortcuts, and one of them should contain the startup arguments for Vulkan. On Windows, you can choose between DX12 and Vulkan rendering modes. On Linux, you can only choose the Vulkan rendering mode, which will be the default one. And on Windows, the default one will be the DX12. You can also specify the startup arguments inside Visual Studio very easily. If you open the project properties, in the debugging properties, just enter whatever command arguments you want here, like Vulkan. And then if you run it from Visual Studio, it will respect that command line argument and start as Vulkan. If you don't want to build the editor or Wicked Engine for yourself, but you want to use pre-built binaries, for example, you are using the Steam version, you don't have to build anything in Visual Studio. The shaders are automatically embedded for you inside the executable. You can't develop in C++ that way, but you can still develop Lua applications easily. You already know that you can open Lua scripts from the editor with the open button, dragging and dropping Lua scripts into it, or using the play button. But what if you actually want to ship a simple game with that you only written with Lua, and you have the editor as well, the editor executable? Well, for that you can just edit the startup.lua. If this file is found near the executable of the editor or any Wicked Engine application for that matter, then it will first thing execute these scripts. And within this script, you can make something that executes a game script before actually the editor starts up, and then only the game script will be available for your users if they click on the executable, and it won't load up the editor. Let's say that I want to open the fighting game script first thing the application starts up instead of the editor. You can enter the standard do file Lua command and specify the path of the fighting game sample. Save this file, and if you start up the editor, it will start up the editor without actually starting the editor, but immediately jumping into the fighting game. So it kind of looks like you're not even getting the editor, just the game. But this requires the Lua scripts to be available from those specified folders that you specified in the startup.lua script.